Greetings, everybody. Pernak here with another episode of Paper School. All right, in this episode of Paper School, I'm going to talk about sizing. So the first thing, what is sizing? Well, sizing it's a material that is added to paper, and it does two things. It controls how tough your paper can be, the surface of it, and also how much water your paper absorbs, both of which are very important things, especially for printmakers. So we also look at, so there are different degrees and types of sizing. So the first one we're going to look at is the types of degrees of it. So the first one is considered unsized or water leaf paper. This is actually quite common. For the most part, most of you are familiar with a water leafed paper. Paper towel is water leafed. It is still a paper product. It's still technically paper, but you see how absorbent that is. That sucks up everything that you drop it on. Same with blotting paper, which is not as known. It used to be very popular for people with dip pens, because they would take that and then dab their pen on it and it would suck up the extra ink and things like that, so you didn't get drops of ink everywhere. But basically blotting paper and paper towels, toilet paper, those types of things are unsized or water leaf papers. There's really not much that you're going to use as a printmaker besides those things, just to wipe up things. There's very few papers that are unsized for a printmaker. I believe there is one from Mule that is unsized, and I've used it, and you have to be very careful with it. It works really well dry, but you can't get it wet, because otherwise it just kind of bleeds everywhere. It bleeds, and that's what sizing does. It controls how much things will bleed, really, when you look at it. The next degree of paper is going to be called what we call slack size paper, and it has very little, they call it little to moderate internal sizing. And basically, really what that does is the more sizing you have in a paper, let's say you take a piece of paper and you take wet India ink and you just draw a line across that paper, and you can see how much the paper bleeds out, it feathers out. The lines aren't crisp, they are soft. The softer lines mean the paper has less sizing. So the straighter, the more crisp your line is, the more sizing your paper has. And that's good because it controls things like your ink from bleeding out. And it's your printer paper. It's pretty much almost every paper you've used. There are pretty much almost every paper you use is going to be slack sized. That includes your BFK, your Stonehenge, and everything else that you guys like to use. Even your Japanese papers are going to be slack sized. Finally, there is the hard size papers. Really, those are the ones where paper needs a lot of water resistance. Think milk cartons and juice boxes, things like that. It's also used on very fine coated papers in the offset printing industry, because the offset printing industry is basically a lithography process, which, of course, as you know, lithography works on the whole premise of water and oil don't mix. So water is very important with that, because papers will pick up a little bit of moisture, so it needs to kind of repel that moisture, which is why it's so important for those types of papers to be hard sized. It's also used on labels. Anything you have with labels, so that way your glue doesn't bleed through and cause problems. So many of our labels are also hard sized for that purpose. And then we're going to get into the types of sizing. There are two types, internal and external sizing. So basically, internal sizing is when they add it to the slurry of paper pulp and water. And traditionally, that sizing was rosin and alum. And that's all they really used. But the problem with rosin and alum is rosin is slightly acidic, which will eventually turn your paper yellow and brittle, and it will fall apart many years down the road. And alum was added to the paper to make the rosin stick better to the paper. I mean, the rosin stuck to the alum, and then the alum stuck to the paper. That's really kind of how it worked there. There was nothing really special about those products, but you can still make paper traditionally that way if you want to. But keep in mind that paper will yellow over time because it does turn acidic. But they have created synthetic sizing since then, especially in like in the last 100 years or so. Sometimes it even has optical brighteners that added to it. So really, really, really bright papers sometimes have things added to it to make them appear whiter and brighter. But those synthetic sizes, I can't really pronounce them, but it's alkyl Kentine dimmer and alkyl succinate anhydride. I can't pronounce them. They're big chemicals. They are supposed to be organic chemicals and everything, but they add those to most paper makers add those to their papers now because they are not acidic and they don't turn their paper yellow. So all your fine printing papers are going to have those added to it. So the other type of paper sizing, so we talked about the internal where they add internal. The other one is external paper sizing. It's also called, what do they call that? Surface sizing or tub sizing. If you hear any of those three terms, they're all the same thing. It's basically a material that is added to the paper right before it completely dries, so that way it sits right on the surface of the paper. It's usually a starch. Yes, sorry. It's usually a starch paper, or starch is added to the surface of the paper. There are some companies that use gelatin, and there are some companies that use acrylic copolymers and things like that, other synthetic ones. So those of you who are maybe you're vegan or you're against animal cruelty, stay away from certain papers because they use gelatin sizing. Now, as printmakers, there aren't very many tub-sized papers that you need to look for. I was going to say some of your, let's see here, Arches Text Wove is going to be a tub-sized purposefully because it's a very strong, tough paper, which is great for things like your letterpress and if you're a calligraphy artist and you're drawing. Paper it's not going to bleed through your paper. So that one is very important, like that. Many of your fine art papers too, your Bristol papers and other types of drawing papers are externally sized. Most of your print papers will not be. There's a few that are, like I said, Arches Text Wove is one example of one because it's got a very tough surface. And that's really what it does is it increases the toughness of the surface. You see it mostly in watercolor paper. So if you're a big watercolorist and you're using Arches paper, but you are against, all animal cruelty and you don't want to have any animals killed for anything you do, you better switch papers because Arches uses gelatin, which is an animal byproduct. One paper that doesn't, I believe, and I remember people telling me this, and I've heard it from multiple people, but I haven't heard it from any rep from Fabriano. Their Fabriano Artistico supposedly uses an acrylic copolymer. So those of you who are against any kind of animal cruelty, look at Fabriano. They have a acrylic copolymer sized paper. And as printmakers, sizing really isn't that important, but it can be. But knowing how your paper is sized, and there are tests that you can do for that, to test how much sizing is in your paper. I never really done it before. I just know that if I've used a paper and it doesn't do what I want, I'll try another paper and I'll realize, okay, maybe this one has more sizing than the other. Because I know I did that before with I believe it was German etching paper, if I remember correctly, from Hahnemühle, and it was unsized paper, and I soaked the paper first before I used it because I've never used the paper before. I didn't realize it was unsized until I printed my first print with it, and it just bled everywhere. And I was like, ooh, this is not good. I was not happy with that. There are some printing techniques that you do need specific kind of sizing for. The one that really stands out to me is, I was going to say, Arches Plantine. Um, and it's for platinum photography printing, or what is they call it, palladium printing. It uses special types of formulated sizing so we can get nice, good, clean, crisp prints for it. So like I said, as printmaking, sizing is important, but it's not too important. If you have a paper that bleeds a lot, probably is unsized, so you might want to try something else. But unless you're doing something like with watercolor and printing, you probably really don't need to worry too much about it. That is one other thing that's really interesting when you talk about paper that's size, watercolor versus printing paper. Printing paper is much more absorbent. If you put watercolor on a print paper, it's going to absorb it. And it's going to pretty much hold it and lock it in place. It's not going to spread out. Watercolor paper is going to spread out, but that's because the surface sizing is keeping the water from penetrating the paper so everything stays on the top. If you try to do that with printing paper, it's going to just feather out and absorb into the paper, unlike watercolor paper, which watercolor just sits right on the surface of that paper. So if you're combining watercolor and printing, just keep that in mind if you're using a print paper, because if you apply a watercolor to it, it's just going to stay right where you put it. So that's class today. Sizing, important, but not super important when you really think about it, because most papers are slack size. You're not really going to try printing on anything that has very little sizing. And if you do, just keep that in mind and know how it's going to act for you. But yeah, until next time, guys. See ya. Bye. Remember, if you like my class, give me a thumbs up down below, or if you have any questions, type them below. I would love to hear from you. If you have any comments or maybe something you don't like that I do on my channel or some way I can improve it, let me know. I like constructive criticism. I've got a tough skin. I can take it. Also, remember, I also have links to my Instagram, and I do have a Twitter up too, and my, and my Tumblr. If you want to follow along some of my other things, I will post when I put new videos up on those. I will also post my artwork on those too, so things that you don't always see on this channel. What else is there? Oh yeah, my Etsy shop. You can also visit my Etsy shop and help support me by buying a print. Anyways, thank you.